Welcome to the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth online seminar series. The center conducts research and provides trainings and technical assistance which investigate problems, craft solutions, and design actionable strategies for translating research into usable, feasible, and effective strategies for transitioning stakeholders, which include VR agencies, policymakers, researchers, transitioning youth and their family, educators, practitioners, and employers. Our online seminars are designed to provide VR counselors and other youth employment stakeholders with short training lessons on a wide variety of topics related to VR practices and youth outcomes. Each seminar is conducted by well-respected content experts. Check out our website at www.vrpracticesandyouth.org and check it out frequently for new seminars, publications, free webinars on topics related to providing effective vocational rehabilitation services to youth and young adults, or to contact us directly with questions. The Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Community Living. Now, on to the seminar.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining me for this webinar sponsored by the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center for Vocational Rehabilitation and Youth. Today's session is called Vocational Rehabilitation Outcomes for Students Participating in a Model Seamless Transition Program. My name is Rich Luecking. I'm with the University of Maryland, and I will be sharing today findings generated from a vocational rehabilitation demonstration project funded by the Rehabilitation Services Administration. And I, along with colleagues from the University of Maryland and Mathematica Policy Research Incorporated, have examined vocational rehabilitation services and outcomes from a model we implemented in Maryland. We think it's particularly useful today given contemporary efforts to implement the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, or WIOA. So this study looks at data from the model we implemented before WIOA, but it's important and has contemporary relevance because what we looked at actually influenced some of what's now in WIOA and also now has relevance for how WIOA is implemented throughout the country. So I hope this information will be helpful and provide some evidence about some of the key aspects of how to implement not only effective transition services, but WIOA. So the next slide, please. So we have, we designed a model which was based on the existing research at the time we implemented it, and the research that existed then, which was in 2007 when we started this project, and has been strengthened by research since that time, suggests the following: that first of all, work-based experiences, especially paid employment during high school, strongly predicts adult employment for youth with disabilities. This is key to the model that I'm going to be talking about because it's heavily featured in it, and it features both paid and unpaid work experiences during the high school years. I'll give more detail about that later. Another important aspect of recent research suggests that collaboration between schools, vocational rehabilitation, and other partners is effective to the extent that it is outcome-driven. In other words, when various partners involved in transition, for example, schools, vocational rehabilitation, community rehabilitation providers, post-secondary education institutions, American Job Centers, when collaboration between those entities occurs, it will be most effective when, as opposed to meeting to talk about the next handoff or how they will coordinate services, if they meet about developing outcomes for specific students, the collaboration is going to be most effective. Again, I'll talk more about that. And also key to research, and also key now to the WIOA, is that early vocational rehabilitation case initiation is associated with successful youth engagement and successful case closure. In other words, even before WIOA was implemented, it was a finding that those cases that were initiated well before school exit by vocational rehabilitation, those students were more likely to be successfully employed, and vocational rehabilitation agencies were more likely to have successful rehabilitation closures. So this research is part of the backdrop for the model I'm going to be describing. So if you go to the next slide, you see that the kind of parallel to bring this to the present day, we now have the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, or WIOA, and three things it features, which is consistent with the research, is that work experience, in fact, pre-employment transition services, or PREETs, in WIOA includes work experience as a service that vocational rehabilitation can authorize and provide before students exit school. So that's a important parallel to the research that finds that that's helpful. Also, WIOA expects and promotes VR and local education agency collaboration so that they share information and resources and planning, key part of WIOA, and it will, as you will see, it's a key part of the project I'll be describing. And that WIOA also features case service referral well before projected school exit for eligible or potentially eligible students for VR services. So given the research and given the current landscape of WIOA, I think the project I'll be talking about will shed a little bit more light on what seems to be a very important aspect of how to deliver these services. So the model I'm going to be talking about, if you go to the next slide, we called it the Maryland Seamless Transition Collaborative, or known by its acronym MSTC, featured these interventions, which were delivered in coordination with one another and in consistent with one another, and along with the planned delivery of these services, which I'll explain. But discovery, which is basically a way of gathering information about a student's skills and a student's preferences and the student's need for accommodation and support when they're on the job, and that happens continuously through their participation in this project. Work experiences, as I mentioned, are predominantly featured as part of this model, including paid employment. Family supports throughout. Again, research suggests, I didn't include this earlier in my slide, but it's important to note that expectations from family members about employment prospects of students with disabilities increases the likelihood that they will be employed as they exit school. So that was featured in this project. And a very important feature, in fact, one of the most important aspects of this project, was that early VR case initiation occurred well before students were projected to exit high school. So this was before WIOA, before it was required that this happen. This was a feature of the model. We tested it in this model during the course of its initiation, its implementation. And of course, systems linkages and collaboration, the idea that there would be a collaborative team of agencies and professionals working on behalf of each student, from the schools, vocational rehabilitation, community rehabilitation providers, post-secondary education institutions, and American Job Centers. And then, of course, it's important, because the students are still in school, that these services be delivered in coordination with teachers and instructional staff. So the next slide, just a quick idea of what the intent of this model is, because we called it the Maryland Seamless Transition Collaborative. Seamless is the key word there to describe transition, because what we intended was that this model would represent a sequential delivery of specific transition services that begins early in high school, and that it integrates the resources of transition partners, the ones that I've described previously and mentioned, and that the result would be that there would be an uninterrupted collaborative transition from post-secondary education to either employment or post-secondary education, or both. In other words, the student would exit school either employed or prepared to continue their pursuit of employment and adult careers. So they would seamlessly go from being a student to an employed adult, or to an adult or to an adult that's pursuing training for ongoing career development. So the next slide illustrates what the MSTC services look like, kind of a graphic illustration of how the student progressed through the model. So the idea was that we would start early in 10th grade, which is on the far left side of your screen. The model services delivery would begin in 10th grade, or in the cases of those students who are in ungraded programs 3 years prior to their projected exit. And this typically means students who are going to go through school through the maximum age of 21 years old, and who would be exiting typically without a diploma, but with a certificate of completion. So 3 years prior to their exit, this would begin. For other students, this means their sophomore year. So in that 10th grade, or 3 years prior to exit, the discovery would begin. In other words, the process of gathering information about a student's skills and interests and need for accommodation would begin. And as it indicates on this slide, it continues throughout. In other words, this is a fluid process, because as students progress through high school and as students experience work and other things in their lives, their preferences will change, their interests will change, their skills will grow, and they and their teachers and their families and the professionals who support them will have a better idea of what kinds of accommodations they require to be successful on the job. Also in 10th grade, the family support is ongoing. In other words, families would be involved in the planning, and the families would be encouraged to support the participation of these students in services and programs that would lead to work. And then, of course, throughout there would be coordination with the educational services, because, again, these students are participating in schools. It's important to engage and involve teachers and other educational support professionals. So in the 10th grade, in the 11th grade, then, or 2 years prior to school exit, work experiences would begin. Students would be linked with work experiences in community-based employment situations. In other words, employers would be solicited who would provide opportunities for youth to come into their workplace and be exposed to work and work activities. Also in the 11th grade, the VR case would open. In other words, each student who participated in this model became a VR service recipient beginning in 11th grade. So that means for 2 full years before they exited school, they would have an open VR case, which has several advantages, which I'll talk about as I go through this. And then by the 12th grade, or 1 year prior to exit, they will have had at least one paid employment work experience, where they would actually be paid by an employer for work they are doing at or above minimum wage. And so, in other words, it would be a real job. And they would be linked also during that time, during that last year of school, to any kind of post-secondary supports. If they needed support, ongoing support, for example, job coaching from a CRP, that link might happen at this point. Or they might need support as they enter into post-secondary education, to student support services, that type of thing. Those linkages would occur prior to school exit. So once they leave school, they would be employed, and/or they would be in post-secondary education receiving follow-up supports as needed. In other words, they would transition seamlessly from being a student to being either employed or enrolled in post-secondary education. They would contribute to their career development, or both. So the next slide. So just a little bit about MSTC implementation, so that I can set the stage for the findings that we garnered from this project. The Maryland Department of Rehabilitation Services received a grant from the U.S. Department of Education Rehabilitation Services Administration to operate a 5-year program from 2007 to 2012, during which time we targeted to enroll 400 students over the course of those 5 years who would participate in this model and who would be students in one of 11 county-wide school districts. So that in Maryland, each county functions as a school district. So each county constitutes one school district in the state. There are a total of 24 counties. So 11 counties participated in this model, which means almost half of the counties in the state participated during this demonstration. So the participants who were recruited had to be basically the criteria were two. One is that they had to be eligible for Department of Rehabilitation Services, or DORS, and the second thing is, of course, they had to consent to participate. And in order to ensure fidelity of implementing the model that I described in the previous graphic, the model featured had available to it technical assistance from a nonprofit agency, Transcend Incorporated, which has a lot of experience in implementing and evaluating transition programs. The role of Transcend was critical because it enabled, with a relatively high degree of confidence, that each of these 11 school districts would be implementing the model in the way that it was intended. The other key thing about this is that the model was designed so that it would apply not to a specific group of students or category of students by disability or any other factor, but any student who's eligible for VR could participate. So that means that this wasn't a disability-specific intervention. It's something that can be applied to any group or category or individual who is receiving special education services in their schools. In fact, some of the county school districts decided to focus this model on, they had the choice to focus it on a particular group of students in their counties. So in some counties, they chose students who would be prone to drop out of school. Some school districts decided to focus the model on students who would need post-secondary support from a community rehabilitation provider, and most school districts provided the service to both. But again, the model was meant to be applicable across the board to any group of students that was involved. I'll explain more about that as I go here. But so we wanted to analyze what happened to these students, what kinds of services did they get, and just as important, what happened to them after they finished school, which is why our analysis occurred after the project was over. So what we did was we looked at the administrative case records that DORS kept from between the years 2007, when the first students graduated, through 2013, when the next group of students finished school. And so we were able to compare all the Mystic youth enrolled, and in this case we had administrative files on 377 because there was some attrition over the course of time. So we were able to compare 377 Mystic youth with non-Mystic youth in the same counties, so that we can get an indication of how the implementation of this model might have affected their services and their outcomes. So we used, I won't get into the statistical analysis part of this, but we used a process which we call propensity scoring, which made it possible to, as close as possible, match the non-Mystic participants with the Mystic participants in terms of characteristics, age, and so forth. So we actually looked at records of over 6,000 non-Mystic students and we compared them. So that way we would have relative confidence that what happened to the Mystic youth was significantly different from what happened to the non-Mystic youth, statistically speaking. In other words, we're pretty confident that the comparisons were fairly accurate. So if you go to the next slide, which shows the number of participants, just to give you an idea of how across the board this applied, 70% of the participants were males. Ethnicity, 61% were white, 36% black, and then the rest were other. And then by disability, you can see that we had a pretty fair distribution across various disability types. 14% of the participants had an intellectual disability, 14% had psychiatric or behavioral disabilities, 20% had specific learning disabilities, 18% had autism, and then 34% with other disabilities of various other kinds. So from this you can tell that in terms of gender, ethnicity, and disability, there was a fairly robust diversity among the group. And so again, this should confirm a little bit about the applicability of the model across student categories. So here's what we found, and here's where we get into the interesting aspects of how services were delivered to these MSTC students compared to how they were delivered to non-MSTC students. And then we'll also talk about what kinds of outcomes they achieved. So comparing the two groups, MSTC students had a shorter time between eligibility and the development of the individual employment plan. That should be IEP written rather than IPE. But the individual plan for employment, IPE. Those of you who are familiar with that lingo, this refers to the plan that's developed for each client of vocational rehabilitation services. So by an average of 104 days between eligibility and the development of the IEP, MSTC students, that happened earlier for them. Now, this makes sense because if their cases are opened earlier and the collaboration is happening between schools and with vocational rehabilitation, information is shared more quickly, the student is engaged more quickly, and so the IEP is developed in a much more shorter time frame. So that makes it the service initiation earlier, and that the student receives services earlier than is typical. They also receive more job training, job search assistant, on-the-job support services. Now, remember, this was implemented pre-WIOA, which means that these are service categories that existed at the time before pre-ETS existed. So in other words, vocational rehabilitation services, as they're labeled at the time, the students who participated in MSTC received direct job training and job search assistance and on-the-job support services. They received more of that than the comparison group. And conversely, they received less assessment and diagnostic and treatment services. So from this, we can infer that they had, again, sharing information between schools and the ARC. The VR agency meant that they didn't have to do the typical assessment to find out what the students could do and wanted to do, because that was happening throughout the course of this. And so there was less need to develop that, and more focused on the job training and job search and on-the-job support services, because work was a key feature of this intervention. If you go to the next slide, and this has lots of implications for vocational rehabilitation policy and implementation in the post-WIOA world, because compared to the non-MSTC students, MSTC participants had lower service costs. In fact, an average of $1,200 less money was spent on MSTC students than was spent on non-MSTC students. Again, this kind of makes intuitive sense in that if the VR is working collaboratively with the schools and the CRPs and other agencies, then they're effectively maximizing the respective resources of all those collaborators and ending up spending less money. Another key important finding, which I'll discuss a little bit more as I get toward the end of this. And then this is kind of the converse of developing the IPE early. That MSTC students, there was a longer time between application and closure. In fact, there was almost a 200-day difference in that. So, of course, again, this makes sense because if their cases are open well before they exit school, they won't be closing the case until after they exit high school typically, so they're going to be on the case a little longer. But and that makes sense. and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just means that the case is open longer. But the good news is that even though the case is open longer, the VR is spending less money on these students. So that's the service outcomes. If I can just summarize that again quickly, less money was spent on students, but cases were open for a longer period of time, and more services were provided relating to work preparation than in assessment and diagnostic services. So that was the case for this group of students as compared to those students who did not participate in this intervention in the same counties where this project was implemented. So if you go to the next slide, here are more, so that was the differences in the services. Key outcome findings, which I think is really the bottom line here. What happened to the MSTC students as compared to the students who did not participate in the model? Do their outcomes look better or not in comparison? And so here's what we found. MSTC students were more likely to be employed by a pretty large margin. In other words, 55% of VR service recipients who went through the MSTC project were employed versus 33% of those who did not participate. Not only is it a statistically significant difference in terms of our statistical analysis, but it's just a huge difference, period. With high degree of confidence, we can say that this intervention significantly improved the likelihood of individuals with disabilities leaving school and becoming employed. So that's one of the key findings. So let me just, I want to just make sure I have the right slide prepared for the next thing. So yeah, so anyway, on the same slide, 55%, as I said, versus 33%, very significant difference in the finding. However, the MSTC students earn less per hour. This is in 2015 dollars, $8.07 versus $8.60 was the average hourly earnings. So that, in other words, the MSTC students who had a closed VR case earned a little bit less, not significantly, but enough to notice it. And they also worked a couple of fewer hours, 22 hours versus 24.7. Now, these are the average number of hours, which are typical of youth of this age group. So that means they earned about $36 less per week on average at the time of closure. So, so more were working, significantly more were working. They earned slightly less. What that means is kind of open to interpretation, but I'll discuss that a little bit before we finish here. More key outcomes. If you again, one of the outcomes was that the VR cases, VR spent less money, which is a service indication that they spent less money with better outcomes. So let me just reiterate that again. A significantly higher percentage of youth who participated in MSTC were employed, and than those students who did not participate. So one can assume, what are some of the implications of that? If you go to the next slide, which I've already talked about in a couple of different ways, but overall, just to summarize, the MSTC intervention resulted in a faster time to the individual plan for employment, but the cases were open longer. They cost less in terms of VR service dollars. They included more work-focused services as opposed to diagnostic or assessment services. And they ended up becoming employed at a higher rate, although they had slightly lower earnings. So these are kind of the four key overall takeaways from our analysis. The implications of this, I'll discuss as soon as but I want to just talk about limitations first, which is on the next slide. So these results are correlational, not causal. What that means is that it's more likely because of the intervention that these youth had different outcomes, but it doesn't mean that the intervention caused the outcomes, because we don't have a true comparison group, or it wasn't a randomized controlled trial where people were randomly selected to participate. They were enrolled by choice, and the comparison group, which is a pretty good match, but it isn't a perfect match as a random assignment trial would be. So the results are correlational. So we can say that these things were more likely to happen because of the intervention, but we can't say that the intervention directly caused it. It's a subtle but important difference to note if you're a researcher. If you're not a researcher, it's important to note that things were better for the MSTC students than the non-MSTC students, and we are pretty confident that it's because of the intervention itself. So the other thing is that it would be helpful to, if you see the last bullet there on that slide, is that we were able to, if we had a record of their post-exit earnings, say 4 or 5 years beyond this case closure, we would be able to better analyze the long-term impacts of the intervention. We don't have that, and something we should continue to study, and we intend to do, as I'll mention in just a little bit. So the implications. So here we are in 2018, several years since this project ended. The project ended in 2013. The analysis was done with their closed cases as of 2016. But even though this project was implemented before WIOA, it has significant implications for what we now do in the post-WIOA context. So one main implication, the first bullet there on this slide, is that early VR case initiation yields better outcomes, which obviously that's taken into account in the WIOA regulations, which now say that 70% of VR money should be spent on students with disabilities before they exit high school. So that's really our findings are consistent with that requirement. Active outreach and case referral by VR counselors for students before they exit school is going to pay off. So that confirms the wisdom of that kind of provision that's now in WIOA, because in two things will happen. One, for the students, they're more likely to be employed if that happens, which is what we all are hoping to see happen more of. And of course, for the VR service system itself, it means that they'll have a higher incidence of a higher degree of successful case closures. In other words, they're more likely to get successful case closures and spend less money than they would otherwise. So all important implications for how VR services are delivered. And the other thing that I think is really a key implication of our study is that there are 5 categories of pre-ETs, and one of those categories is work-based experiences. And so what our study suggests is that since work experience was such a critical part of this intervention, and since the students experience better post-school outcomes, that VR counselors might consider using that category of pre-ETs kind of in more prominence than the other 4 categories. The other 4 categories being career exploration counseling, self-advocacy training, work readiness training, and counseling for post-secondary education. Because those other 4 are probably useful in various contexts, but there's no research to support that any of them directly correlate to better outcomes, whereas work experiences do. And so I think the focus on the work experience category of WIOA pre-ETs bears important notice by folks in the field. And then finally, another key implication of all this is that through multi-partner collaboration, resources can be maximized. The fact that less VR money was spent on MSTC students versus non-MSTC students suggests that when partners are pooling their efforts and their resources on behalf of mutually served students, that they'll all spend less money, or at least VR will, and that better outcomes will occur, so that the resources are maximized for better outcomes. So the The requirement in WIOA, for example, that VR and schools collaborate early and often is supported by the findings of this particular study. So if you go to the next slide, other implications are that, whoops, that looks like a, okay, I'm sorry. So again, in conclusion, to just summarize what we've learned, the evaluation of the study demonstrated the potential effectiveness of work-focused transition intervention. And again, it doesn't suggest that it causes the better outcomes, but it does suggest that better outcomes are correlated with this kind of intervention. And just to reiterate, the intervention was designed, the MSTC intervention with the various components were designed based on existing research at the time, which suggested those components individually would help in students' transition. What we did in this model was combine all of those elements into a single coordinated transition model designed to maximize what we know works into one model of service delivery. And so, again, what this suggests is that let's base our services delivery on what we know works as opposed to what we hope might work. And so the strategic management of services and resources, in other words, early case initiation, workforce-focused experiences, and outcome-oriented service collaboration between the various partners equals both less service costs and better service outcomes. I don't think that it's really hard to argue with the efficacy of that kind of approach. Now, we haven't learned everything about this, so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And future research questions, if we go to the next slide, is we need to ask ourselves, what's the reason for lower earnings? We don't know because we haven't looked into that, but we do know that the MSTC students earn slightly less, not significantly, but slightly less. So we should ask, is this because of the particular IPE goals? Was it because there was some selection bias? Was it because more students with more support needs were recruited into MSTC than not? We don't know any of that. So those are things worth studying. And then the other important thing here is that service change over time. Do earnings change over time post-closure? In other words, after VR closes its case, then we hope that they would continue to be employed, but we don't know that either, so we have to study that in the long term. And then finally, which is not on this slide, but I think it's important to mention, and it directly reflects some research direction we're going with this, is that we need to have a better comparison between folks who receive the intervention and folks who do not. So a randomized trial implementation would be very helpful to us. And so we're going to be doing that, and I'll explain that in just a second. If you go to the next slide, though, if you're interested in learning more about this study and its implications, on that website that's listed on the slide there's a summary of this study. This is from the website of the RRTC on VR practices and youth. And so I think if you're interested in, again, reviewing what I told you today in this session, you can go to that website. And actually, I would recommend going to the website anyway for other information about studies that are underway under the RRTC. So the VR practices, if you Google VR practices and youth, you'll get this website, the website of the RRTC, and this summary of this research and summary of other research that we're doing is all included there, including other webinars that have been done on the various research topics. So a useful resource for you on that. There is a full report. We published these findings in the Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin, and again, that website that's listed on the slide there will get you access to the report. So you can go there for that. Alternatively, the easier thing might be, instead of copying this long website address, is to just go to Google Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin and look up this study, and you can find out how to retrieve it and get into the weeds about how we conducted this research and did the comparison. So if you go to the next slide, just another piece of information might be useful for folks. We published an article earlier about what this model looked like, and we published that in the Career Development and Transition for Exceptional Individuals journal. And again, if you go to that website, this is the article and the issue and page numbers in which it exists in that particular journal. So that's an article we published before we actually did the analysis that I talked about today, but it gives more background on the model, what it looks like, what are the details of the components that are included in the model, and what were some initial findings that we present before we did this analysis that I talked about today. So I mentioned that we're doing other research. So currently underway in Maryland is another RSA-funded research study that the Maryland Department of Rehabilitation Services is conducting with the help of some of us at the University of Maryland and at Mathematica Policy Research. And that project will be taking essentially a refined version of the MSTC model and implementing it in a very rigorous randomized control study so that students are recruited to participate in this project. They have a half of the students who are recruited will be in what we call the enhanced services group. They will receive the services in this model, and then the other half will receive services that exist, services as usual, or in the lingo of research, they will be in the control group. Now, the new thing about this current study is that we have the ability to look at this very, very carefully, and we're also doing it in the context of what is now called pre-ETS. Each student who participates in this model will get pre-ETS services from the VR agency 2 years before, beginning 2 years before they exit, and the pre-ETS service they will receive is work-based learning experiences and paid employment. So again, through a collaborative model of agencies working together on behalf of individual students. So it'll have many of the same components of MSTC, but it will be upgraded or updated, I should say, so that it includes a focus on pre-ETS, so that it will be studying directly the implementation of pre-ETS. So stay tuned for that. This program is now in its second year of 5. We won't have any outcome data available for 2 or 3 years yet, but we will have periodic reports, and we will work with our partners at the RRTC to post them as they become available. That's a summary of the research we provided. I've given you some information about how to get more detail on the study. I want to say, just a reminder that if you go to the final slide, the study is sponsored by the RRTC on VR Practices in Youth, which is a partnership between Transcend Inc., the University of Maryland, and Mathematica Policy Research Inc. Researchers from those 3 entities are working together on a series of studies, including the one I just talked about, but there's 5 others plus sub-studies underway that you might find interesting by going to the website that I told you about. It's important to note that the whole project is funded by the National Institute of Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, which is in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So under a grant from that entity, these partners are conducting the research that is underway on this topic, including the topic that I presented today. Hope this is helpful. Again, if you want more information, you know where to go, and we wish you good luck in your work with youth who are making that important transition from school to adult employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices in Youth online seminar. Thank you.